Reg Ankrom, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois Channel. And for the sake of the viewers, I wanted to bring up that Reg is writing 3 volumes on the life of Stephen Douglas. We talked to him earlier on his first volume, which covered Douglas's life from 1833 to 1843. And now volume 2 is out, and that is Stephen Douglas, Western Man, The Early Years in Congress, 1844 to 1850. And Reg, as I think I said before when we talked, I was surprised at all the research you've done, but in the sense that all that you could find that was available to tell the story of Stephen Douglas. Let's set up just briefly, and then I want to get right into why does this matter for the viewers? Why should we, well, let's just start there. Why should we care about Stephen Douglas, who died in June of 1861? But I think you would say that what he did during his lifetime and his time in Congress continues to impact the nation to this day.
Right. I was surprised myself, Terry, to find that only a handful of books had been written about Stephen Douglas. I knew nothing about him before I started researching him. I came to Douglas by way of Abraham Lincoln. I was actually hooked on Lincoln, reading Lincoln, and I love Lincoln with a passion. He's our nation's civil saint in my estimation. But in any case, where Lincoln left more than 1 million documents for researchers and authors and historians to review and analyze, only a handful of documents were available for Stephen Douglas. So that made it difficult to try to find out who this man was and why he was important. I really didn't know. But one thing that Douglas did leave was transcriptions through the Congressional Globe and the National Intelligencer and so on. What we have is not paperwork for Douglas, but we do have his orations. And that became so important to me to understand who Douglas was and to see the impact he had in the mid-19th century and why it's important to know him today. My belief is that, Douglas died in 1861 at the beginning of the Civil War, and Abraham Lincoln prosecuted that war for 4 years. And the reason my belief is he's a civil saint, in the prosecution of that war, his vision of the war, the purposes of the war changed greatly, from basically preserving the Union as a confederation of states to the emancipation of slaves. The single problem we had from the beginning of our nation and even before, and the vestiges continue this day, it was slavery. And Lincoln came to realize that the issue that separated the nation was that one single stain on the nation's robe, and that was slavery. And so at the end of the war, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. And on Good Friday, John Wilkes Booth fired a bullet in the back of his head. And on Easter Sunday, Lincoln was resurrected really in every pulpit in the nation. And he's very much venerated, was very much loved then for what he did. The war had ended just a few days earlier. And so Lincoln was venerated. I believe that in the yin and yang of politics, it's just like the yin and yang of religions. There's an ultimate good, and Abraham Lincoln has served that good. There has to be an ultimate bad. Lincoln had pursued Douglas for 26 years in politics until 1860, unsuccessfully. So Lincoln becoming the ultimate bad had to have ultimate good, had to have an ultimate bad, who ended up being Stephen Douglas. And so history is sort of ignored or critiqued or bad-mouthed Stephen Douglas. And the reason for the research I've done, the latest book took 4 years of research. The reason for that research is I wanted to try to find out myself who Stephen Douglas was. I didn't rely on any other historian. Generally, there are not many historians that consider Douglas. There have only been 13 or 14 books written about him. So I looked at Douglas's own words to determine who he was, and I was surprised. It's fun for me to say that there are professional historians now who've given me at least some accolades or credit for the research I've done and the work I've done in writing about Douglas. I'm not carrying water for Douglas. He has to make his own way, and I believe he does. I try to do that in the book. And so that's how I got to Douglas and how the research has given me who I believe Douglas is, and and I'm pretty pleased with the work. I didn't expect really 3 volumes. I really didn't expect to write the first one, but the first became 2, and the second, as I was proceeding, became 3. The next volume I'm working on now.
And we say here in the cover of your book, Stephen Douglas, Western Man. Why Western Man? What do you mean by that?
Well, there's a number of reasons. 2 main ones, I would say. The first is, at the time Douglas was in Illinois, Illinois was really the westernmost free state in the country, right on the eastern edge of the Mississippi River, bulging into the Mississippi River. Just across the river is the state of Missouri, below that, the state of Arkansas, and below that, the state of Louisiana. So we had Illinois on the east side of the Mississippi, and on the west side were the 3 states that had been organized when Douglas goes to Congress in 1843. The unique thing is, everything else was unorganized. So Douglas, being a Western man, was simply a reflection of his being in really the westernmost United States at the time, except for Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana on the west side. But in addition to that, when he ran for Congress, Douglas told his voters here in Western Illinois, he was a resident of Quincy. He had been a Supreme Court justice and a judge in the 5th Judicial District in the western part of Illinois, ran for Congress, and in August of 1843 was elected on the motto or the promise that he was going to build an ocean-bound republic. There were very few interested in going beyond Missouri or Arkansas or Louisiana, even though there was an interest in organizing Oregon, and there were claims that we should take California, which then belonged to Mexico. But in any case, Douglas believed that the United States should fill the entire continent that we're looking at on the screen. And if you look at the pink sections, those were organized in 1843. Everything else on the left side of that or west of that was unorganized territory. And that's what Douglas approached. He told his voters here, I will build an ocean-bound republic without red lines on the map. And those red lines referred to countries like Great Britain, which had a strong interest in taking Texas, and France, which wanted Louisiana back at the time, and Spain, which was making inroads across the south part of the continent. And Douglas said he would eliminate those red lines on the map by bringing in territories and eliminating any right or any opportunity for them to those foreign countries. And in his overarching viewpoint, Douglas said occasionally, the expansion of the nation is the expansion of liberty. And we'll see exactly what that means as we get into our discussion here. But Douglas's belief was not based on slavery, and it wasn't based, Douglas was really an amoral politician. He didn't sense any morality, didn't believe morality belonged in politics. He believed that morality could guide politics, that people, through their morals and beliefs, could pass legislation that reflected those morals and beliefs.
So there's a handful of issues that come as Douglas goes to Congress in 1850? Do I have, or what year was that?
He was elected in August of 1843 and
Right.
got to Washington, D.C. on December 5th of 1843.
1843. So the issues that the young nation, the United States, is wrestling with are, of course, slavery, which had been there from the very founding of the country, and the whole issue about would slavery expand into the rest of the country. But the other thing, and this is where we come up with the Western man, is the idea of manifest destiny, that the United States should be the nation we know today, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And thus we have the map here. As you say, the pink states are basically what states were in the nation at the time that he comes to Congress. And so Douglas was one of the maybe the key architect, we might say, of putting together the political deals that allowed the country to expand. And I think you would say that your research showed that he did that in a relatively short amount of time where other people had been unable to allow for the development of the West because of all the political opposition to expanding slavery. Is that, did I have that right?
Yeah, that's a very good summation, Terry. And I would like to get into Texas in just a moment because that was the first test of who Stephen Douglas was as an expansionist and, more importantly, as a nationalist. But I think it's interesting that at the time he got there, slavery was ubiquitous. There were many men like Senator and later Congressman Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri, who famously said, "Slavery seems to attach itself to every measure that comes before this Congress." Douglas had heard that, but he really didn't know the impact of that until he got there. And even when he got there, he became immediately immersed in the issue because the U.S. House of Representatives, where he was just taking his seat on December 5th of 1844, was in chaos. The Senate had convened. Everything was done very decorously. Willie Mangum, the Senate president, told the new senators, introduced new senators like Sidney Breese from Illinois and James Buchanan from Pennsylvania, what the rules were, what the hours were, and what the dress code was. And then he told his fellow senators, and we'll adjourn now until the House of Representatives organizes. Well, that was going to take at least a week because at the time, the House was in chaos and it was reaching a constitutional crisis. What happened was 2 years earlier in 1842, the Whigs, one time they controlled Congress and had John Tyler, a Whig president, so they controlled the legislative and executive branches. And during that one time that happened, they passed a Whig law, as it was called, which said that states would elect their congressmen by districts rather than statewide. We Illinoisans know that Illinois had actually done that before Douglas got there. But in fact, like every other state, they started with statewide candidates and statewide congressmen. Joseph Duncan was a congressman from Jacksonville, elected statewide. But what the Whigs saw was Whigs tended to be organized in specific places. They weren't dispersed throughout the states in the way Democrats were. And so in statewide elections, Democrats could count on winning those statewide and national offices. Whigs knew they were in trouble. And even in 1840, Abraham Lincoln in Illinois was asked by 5 Whigs to run for governor in 1842. Lincoln declined and he said, "A Whig will never win statewide office in Illinois." That's what the National Whig Congress saw in 1842 and passed this law. So what happened when Douglas gets there in 1844 to Washington, D.C., the House is in chaos because there were 4 states that refused to follow that law. And there were 22 congressmen elected in those states, 18 of them Democrats, who the Congress was refusing to seat because they violated this law. Anyway, in a weak moment after 4 days, a fellow named John Winston Jones of Virginia was elected House Speaker. And the first thing he does, knowing that Douglas had been a Supreme Court justice at the age of 27 here in Quincy and for Illinois, the youngest Supreme Court justice in Illinois history, and probably that will never be beaten as a record, Jones appoints Douglas to the Committee on Elections and instructs Douglas to find some resolution to this growing problem. And within a matter of weeks, Douglas brought back a report. And the important thing about this report is I think it provides a great understanding for who Douglas was and provided a great predictor to what Douglas would do in his next 18 years in Congress. Because what he wrote and what was accepted by the House of Representatives, Douglas reviewed what records there were of the federal Constitution in 1787 and found nowhere in the Constitution, and this is what he wrote, nowhere in the Constitution is Congress authorized to tell states how to elect their own representatives. And his point was that was a state issue and not a federal issue. And Congress is given latitude, it's directly pointed, but it doesn't have the latitude in any other way, which belongs to the states. And so Douglas resolved that issue in the first few weeks he was there and became, in a sense, the young legendary legislator or congressman because he resolved what was becoming a constitutional issue and did it on a very simple basis. His report was approved. The 22 legislators were seated. And by the way, without their votes, the South would still be able to control Congress. And the problem was the South saw that with district elections, Whigs would have more ability to elect legislators, which jeopardized Southern strength in Congress. That would continue to grow in 1856. Maybe we'll talk about that later. But the proof was in that pudding in 1856 when John C. Fremont, the candidate of the first Republican Party within 2 years of its creation, was almost elected 15th president of the United States. And we can talk about why he wasn't later. So Douglas achieves a significant constitutional win and then goes on from there, starting his, what we talked about, manifest destiny measures with the state of Texas.
Yeah, so we have in effect then the United States. Well, Douglas establishes himself by his intellect, by his ability to get things done that otherwise wouldn't have been done. And one of the things about Douglas that I want to clarify at this point is the knock on him that he was pro-slavery. And former Speaker Madigan, before he left office, directed that they cover up Douglas's portrait in the House chamber and remove a statue of him from the Illinois State Capitol grounds that had been there for years. And it was always the case for 100 years or more that kind of Lincoln and Douglas were the bookends of these two pillars. In fact, in the House chamber, they have, on the Democratic side, the portrait of Douglas now covered, and Lincoln on the Republican side. Now it's kind of like, I think, a misunderstanding. Was in your research, did you find that Douglas was pro-slavery, or is this taking the statue off the Capitol grounds and covering his portrait, is that based on a false assumption of what he was about?
Yeah, very good question, Terry, because one promise that I made to myself was when I have Douglas speaking for himself, he has to speak with honesty, and we have to read with honesty. And here's the problem. The reason I made that promise was because I have found that even great historians, and I've met many of them and appreciate them and greatly respect them, can make mistakes that become compounded. In literature, particularly in literature of history, there can be a herd instinct. And once we have a great historian make a claim, subsequent historians tend to accept what the previous historian has written. And so that is the problem that has occurred with the Douglas issue and slavery. Speaker Madigan pointed out that he had read a book by Sidney Blumenthal, who is a great historian. Blumenthal wrote a series of books on Abraham Lincoln, I think the Third Powers of the Earth. And in that book, Blumenthal claims that Douglas inherited a 2,500 acre plantation in Mississippi and inherited 100 and some slaves at plantation in Mississippi. What the book indicates was that when Douglas was married, he married a young woman named Martha Denny Martin from North Carolina. She was from a slave-owning family. The Martin family owned two plantations, one in North Carolina, but they also owned one in Mississippi on the Pearl River in Lawrence County. This was the one that Blumenthal indicated Douglas was given as a wedding gift by his new father-in-law the day after Douglas and Martha Denny Martin were married in 1847. What the difficulty was, my belief was it was true because I've read a number of things where Douglas indicated he would not own slaves, but I could not prove it until I finally found a record in the archives of the state of North Carolina, and that record was the will of Robert Martin Douglas. Contrary to what we understood, Douglas actually turned the gift down. He declined the slave property and the plantation, and in the will that Robert Martin wrote, and which was executed on Martin's death a few years later, the will actually had Martin giving that property to his daughter, who was Douglas's wife. But Mississippi law at the time also prohibited a husband from joint ownership or having any control or authority over his wife's property, regardless of how he got it, whether it was a bequest or whether she bought it or whatever. Douglas had no control over that slave property. So he not only did not own it, he had no control over it. It points out, interestingly, the line in the will, and I have a copy of it here, and this is the copy I got from the State Archives of North Carolina. In the will, Robert Martin tells his daughter, he said, "I remind my dear daughter that her husband said that this is not the kind of property a northern man cares to own." So Martin himself is saying that Douglas declined accepting that property, and by virtue of the fact that Martin left it to his daughter, who then left it to her two sons, and Douglas's son, Stephen Arnold Jr., and Robert Martin, the older of the two boys, that the plantation and the slaves went to them, indicates Douglas never owned it. Douglas never controlled it. Mississippi law gave him the ability to manage it for his sons, which he did, and he could not control it, however, or sell it. He had to go to court to get guardianship for his sons in order to sell the property when he decided to sell it, because the property had flooded on the river and the ground had been exhausted by the lack of rotation of crops. So anyway, he did sell the property, reinvested it in behalf of his sons in another plantation in Mississippi. That was as much control that S. Douglas ever had.
Yeah, so the bottom line is he was not a slave owner, and this whole reaction, as you kind of say, the herd mentality kind of took over. It might be something that the Illinois legislature today might want to reconsider what they're doing if they're not basing their decisions on the historical record. You have here a quote, I don't know when this was from, but of Douglas saying, "We all look forward to the time when Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri will adopt a gradual system of emancipation." And when we talked then about expanding the nation westward, which is why you call it Western Man relative to your second biography here, Douglas is quoted as saying, "I think it's safe," speaking of the undeveloped territory, "I think it's safe to assume that these will be 17 free territories and free states, whether Congress shall prohibit slavery or not." So again, the idea is, as far as I'm reading that, is that he is not urging slavery to be expanded into the western part of the United States. To the contrary, he's saying that these are going to be 17 states that will be free territories, and it doesn't matter at this point whether Congress kind of allows it or not.
Right, and a very important understanding is that Douglas, within a year of his arrival to Congress in 1843, late 1843, but in 1845, the Speaker of the House appointed him chairman of the Committee on the Territories. And subsequently, when he became a U.S. Senator in 1847, the Committee on the Territories was under Douglas's chairmanship as well. So in of the Congress, Douglas was in charge of what likely was the most important committee in the Congress. And what I would say, Terry, is in that position, having the control over the organization of states and possibly the institutions within them. And I'll describe why Douglas wouldn't believe he had that opportunity. But Douglas had the ability, if he had any interest in slavery whatsoever, to make slave states, or to say, we will maintain the balance of slave and free states, or to say they will all be slave states. But the reason Douglas likely did not believe he had the opportunity to say anything about how Congress would act in organizing states like that in that fashion was that he believed that the Constitution said nothing about organizing slave states or free states. The Constitution simply said, as a state came in, it had to have a Republican government. That's all it said about the entry of a state. The rules required certain population levels and the organization of territories, with the creation of legislatures as step two, and excuse me, governor is step one, legislature is step two, and then finally reaching the statehood stage. So Douglas's belief, ultimately, in saying what he said in relation to those quotes you just showed, was that at no time did Congress ever pass a law which stopped the growth or the spread of slavery. He said the Northwest Ordinance of 1797, in which Article 6 said there shall be no slavery or indentured servitude in the Northwest Territory, which included Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Douglas pointed out that Article 6, the Northwest Ordinance, the Anti-Slavery Ordinance, did not prevent the spread of slavery. Illinois itself came in with slaves, and they were grandfathered in along the western side of the state. France had brought slaves in. But not only that, between 1810, the first census, and 1820, the number of slaves in Illinois grew from 100 to almost 1,000. So the result was slavery was expanding even during the territorial period when it was part of the Northwest Territory, which prohibited slavery. Douglas said, we've seen that congressional action didn't work. It did not work with the Compromise of 1820, Douglas said. We saw slavery encroaching still in Illinois, and slavery encroaching above the latitude of the south base of Missouri, 3630, the latitude.
So how did he wrestle with this? I mean, in other words, you had all this power from the southern states who wanted slavery, and Douglas was really about wanting to expand the United States. I'm reading between the lines here, but I think Douglas's viewpoint was, we want to end up forming the nation, and that forming the nation from the Atlantic to the Pacific is what is paramount, and that is critical, that we fill in this space between the oceans, and that other countries, whether it be Canada coming down from the north or Mexico from the south, and you can see Mexico obviously had a lot of control. And by the way, one thing that we haven't talked about that we should, I don't think we've touched on, the war with Mexico in the 1840s that then brought in Texas and those gray areas. The young United States grabbed that massive land, which is now the state of California and Arizona and New Mexico. So that was something else that the Congress had to wrestle with, was it not? That what are we going to do with all this territory, and are these states going to be free states or not? So am I right that from the standpoint of Douglas wanted to bring in these landmass, and he wanted to form the country and not have the whole issue of slavery slow down the development of that land, because there was the threat, you correct me if I'm wrong, that some other nations, whether it be England or Spain, would want to grab some of that for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the authority, and even if it did, it didn't work to stop the spread of slavery. What Douglas did believe was that the states themselves had the right under the Constitution to have its own domestic institutions. Now, let me explain that this way. When the 13 colonies became the 13 states after the American Revolution, all 13 had slavery. And very shortly after that, they started emancipating or manumitting slaves. By the time Douglas gets to Congress, uh, all but 7 states of the original states had eliminated slavery. But what the Constitution still provided was that a new state had the right to the institutions of any original state. Again, all had slavery. In Douglas's belief, any new state, and actually Abraham Lincoln believed the same thing, but any new state had a right to slavery once they became a state uh, as they wished. And the fascinating thing was Douglas's own state, our state of Illinois, actually tried to use that provision, which was called the equal, no, the let's see, equal status provision of the U.S. Constitution, the equal footing provision of the U.S. Constitution, which said we Illinois had the right to any institution original states did. Illinois came a free state after it tried to come in as a slave state in 1818. And then when Edward Coles, in his initial address as the second governor of Illinois, suggested that the state really should do something to stop the spread of slavery in the state of Illinois, the legislature, which was basically dominated by former Southern people who had come to Illinois through, Illinois was settled from the South up. Anyway, the Southern-based legislature said it's time now to, if we're going to have slavery, it's time now to bring it into the state. And in 1824, the legislature put on the ballot a referendum to create a constitutional convention to rewrite the Constitution to make Illinois a slave state. Fortunately, that referendum failed by a ratio of 53 to 47. So Illinois did not become a slave state, but it had the opportunity to try, and it actually did under the equal footing provision of the U.S. Constitution. So Douglas recognizes that the Constitution provides that states can have slavery if they want it. Even New York, which gave up slavery, could once again reinstitute it if it wanted. Or any of those new states that Douglas was going to bring in west of the Mississippi had a right to slavery, but it was the states and not the Congress that would tell them what to do. Um, Texas comes in as a slave state because it had slavery. You may recall in 1835 and 36, Texas fought Mexico for the right to independence. And in 1836, Texas becomes the independent Republic of Texas. It won its battle with Mexico and is now an independent republic. In 1845, it tried like crazy to get annexed, and it was trying before that, but in 1845 made a pretty desperate attempt to become a part of the United States. And so what Congress recognized was, or what Congress thought was, as an independent republic, in order for the United States to acquire the Republic of Texas, it had to have a treaty to take Texas in. A treaty in the Senate requires 2/3 vote. Well, John C. Calhoun, who was the Secretary of State for John Tyler, wrote the treaty, but he made the monumental slip up of saying Texas was going to be brought in to become a slave state. And of course, that skews the votes, particularly of the North. And so they could not get a treaty passed in the Senate. Here comes Stephen Douglas, who in 1845 suggests that Texas was brought in as part of the Louisiana Purchase, and the United States traded Texas for the Floridas. And so the treaty that brought Texas in was abrogated. And Douglas said that was an illegal act by the United States, which had promised in its treaty for the Louisiana Purchase that Texas would be brought into the United States and its citizens would be made American citizens as soon as possible. Well, when Texas was traded to Spain for the Floridas, that treaty was simply ignored. Douglas in 1845 that we're not liable under it. We have a treaty. We don't need to have a 2/3 vote in the Senate, Douglas said. but we can have we can bring Texas in under a joint resolution, which requires simply a majority vote in the two houses. That happened. Douglas had that happen. He wrote the bill and got a Whig named Wilton Brown from Tennessee to sponsor it. And Texas was brought in under a joint resolution created under the idea of Stephen Douglas. And in 1845, Texas became a state. It was a slave state. Douglas did, however, in the bill, the measure that passed and was signed into law, indicate that Texas could be divided into four states to keep a balance between freedom or slavery, but that would be determined by the people who lived there. So in 1845, you can kind of get the sense that Douglas was already talking about something akin to popular sovereignty, that government should not tell people what institutions they should have or how to run them. It should be the people who live with them themselves who make that decision. And Douglas, when Texas came in, was pretty proud of the accomplishment. And he said Texas came in as a slave state, but that wasn't decided by Congress. It was decided by the people who live there. So Texas comes in. The Mexican cession was next on the table because the Mexican War begins in 1846. And in 1848, Mexico, in reparation for the cost of that war, ceded to the United States 550,000 square miles of land, um, which bordered all the way to the Pacific Ocean, which Douglas then helped bring in, and that was a major controversy as well that led to the Compromise of 1850, in which slavery attacked every single position that any those bills that tried to bring those territories in, but Douglas found the way to do it. And uh, if we want to talk about that, Terry, we can talk about the fact that Douglas wrote the bills to bring those states in California, Utah, New Mexico, and then the territories also that would come in as part of the Mexican cession. And Henry Clay, who was the guy who was a senator from Kentucky, who was the great pacificator, put Douglas's bills and other bills together in what was called the omnibus, the first omnibus bill in congressional history, to bring in the Mexican cession, called the Compromise of 1850. Clay worked like crazy with Douglas's support. Douglas advised Clay when he put this omnibus bill together, and Clay did so at the urging of a senator from Mississippi, Henry Foote, and and convinced Clay that the only way the bills would be passed in the South with Southern votes, which were required, would be to put all the bills together in an omnibus. Foote was obviously wrong about that. Clay worked for 7 months from January of 1850 through July of 1850, and in August actually retired or left the Senate, uh, just exhausted. Clay was 75 years old. He'd worked very uh, uh, hard for the passage of the Compromise of 1850 and saw it fall apart when one of his best friends changed just one amendment to New Mexico, and the whole thing started falling apart, state by state, territory by territory, idea by idea. And so Clay leaves Congress. He goes to Newport, Rhode Island, where he lays on a beach to try to recover his health. And within 3 weeks, Stephen Douglas took the bills, took the omnibus bill, separated all of them. As I say, most of them he had written in his own committee. And within 3 weeks, got them through the House or through the Senate where he was, and then through the House, and got them to Millard Fillmore, who was now president. And Fillmore signed them in September of 1850. And so it was Douglas who Clay, and books have been written about him, headlines of Clay, titles of books, Henry Clay and the Compromise of 1850. Clay didn't get it done. He tried very hard, in a hard way, to get the compromise through. He couldn't find the way to get it done. Douglas, within a matter of weeks, passed the Compromise of 1850, which brought in the new state of California. California, at Zachary Taylor's behest, Zachary Taylor succeeded John Tyler as president. And because California couldn't be brought in, the Congress just couldn't bring it in. They couldn't find a way to do it because of slavery. Um, Taylor suggested they go ahead and write their own constitution and bring themselves in, which they did. And in the Compromise of 1850, California became a state under the law that Douglas had written. In the process, Douglas did say, as another quote you put up, that the South would have to understand, and this came, by the way, in a huge debate with Jefferson Davis, in which Davis said Douglas was ignoring the Southern institution of slavery, and Douglas made the point about the South needs to understand that there will be 17 new states. They will all be free states, and he challenged his Congress, his friends on the Senate floor, to prove or to tell them how any state would be a slave state. And I think, as an end to this kind of piece of our discussion here, Douglas was right, really, for the wrong reasons. Uh, David Wilmot really cared nothing about slavery when he introduced his anti-slave proviso, the Wilmot Proviso, which Abraham Lincoln said he voted for 40 times. Douglas didn't vote for it but once, and he had an order from the Illinois legislature to do so. What Douglas believed was what he still believed: that wouldn't stop or end slavery. Uh, but what Wilmot actually wanted, and if you read the transcripts of the speeches, and I felt compelled to do so, adopt a constitution with slavery. And the reason wasn't because they would be anti-slavery. Whites at that time, in the middle of the 19th century, were anti-black. Even in our own state of Illinois, in wonderful communities like Quincy, Jacksonville, Springfield, uh, under the laws that were passed in 1847, blacks were prevented from immigrating into Illinois. They couldn't carry weapons. They couldn't vote. They had virtually no more rights than indentured servants did in Illinois or other free states. So Douglas was right for the wrong reasons. Slavery would not go into those territories because whites did not want to live next to blacks. And Wilmot said that specifically in introducing his amendment to the act that was to fund negotiations for the end of the Mexican War, the Wilmot Proviso.
So let's move along to we had talked about Douglas having the wrong reputation that people look at today. I think that comes somewhat from the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858, where Lincoln was saying we can't, Lincoln famously said we can't remain half free and half slave, and I think people who are not schooled in history, as perhaps they should be, think that Douglas was arguing for slavery, where Lincoln was arguing against slavery. But you would say that was not the case.
Yeah, Douglas himself, if you read comments from his direct associates, believed slavery an outrageous institution. He believed that slavery was economically unfeasible in the long term. And in the debates, he did ask Mr. Lincoln, why can't we just leave the Constitution as the founders created it. And he did say it was for white people, and that was literally true. I mean, with all of the states having slavery, but I think Douglas believed that ultimately slavery would extinguish itself. In talking about those 17 states, particularly the southern states, New Mexico, Arizona, southern part of California, Douglas said climate would control slavery if we didn't. Slavery couldn't go there because climate prevented cotton from growing there, prevented other crops from growing there, and slavery economically could not. He also was very interested in industrialization. Interestingly, he was the one of the first board members of the Smithsonian Institution, and was part of the reason for his interest in the West was the tremendous amount of trade that was available in the Asian area, China. He knew John Astor, whose American trading company was trading furs and later opium with China. Knew that there was an opportunity for the United States to gain as much as 40% more in trade by trading overseas. Well, what did it take to get products there? It would take a railroad. That was the purpose of Nebraska. The rails were really socked in or locked in by the states of Missouri, Arkansas, and Louisiana in the South, and by the territories created by the Indian settlements on the north side of the western side of the Mississippi. And the territory that was free, given the stoppage, which Congress did stop, of the settlement of Indian nations who were being unfortunately sent west, by leaving the Nebraska territory, which basically included Nebraska and Kansas. The Nebraska territory, if you look at the Louisiana Purchase, ran all the way to the Canadian border. But in any case, the one territory through which rails could run was in the Nebraska territory. So that's why Douglas was so adamant, even in 1844, when he introduced his first Nebraska Act, and between 1844 and 1854, when Kansas-Nebraska, the territory of Nebraska was split into Kansas and Nebraska, because Iowa refused, the Iowa senators, no bill would pass if we had a slave state on the west side of Iowa, and the Missouri senators was saying no bill would pass if there was a free state on the west side of Missouri. So you can see why Kansas-Nebraska was created. Douglas simply drew a line and said, okay, we'll have Kansas-Nebraska, Kansas, bordering Missouri, and Nebraska bordering Iowa. So that was the way and the reason Douglas wanted to bring in Nebraska as early as 1844. And he submitted 8 bills. All of them were rebuffed until Kansas-Nebraska of 1854. So Kansas-Nebraska wasn't just a flash in the pan. It was a long-term project of Douglas to expand the nation for commercial purposes, to get products made in the East or along the rails, and he expected great communities to develop along the rails, proven by the development of Chicago, for example, to get to the West Coast for trade with Asian nations like China.
We got a wealth of details, and I want to make sure that maybe people can follow the big story. So, would the United States have been developed the way it was if not for Stephen Douglas? If Stephen Douglas and his ability to manage legislation and balance the interest of both the balance the interests of both those who wanted slavery and those who wanted westward expansion, would the country have developed, or was that really, can we lay the success of bringing the United States and westward expansion all the way to the California and the Pacific? Is that how much of that is due to Stephen Douglas?
All I can say is we know no one else did, including the great Henry Clay, was unable to do it. Others were unable to do it, and the threat that other countries um, gave us indicated that others may not have had a chance to do it without Douglas. Britain had passed had passed an abolitionist law in 1833, and they were making inroads in the state of Texas in the early 1840s. So there was a great concern there. So the point is, there may have been others like Douglas who might have been able to do it, but would they have done it in time to stop the incursion into Texas, into the old Louisiana Territory, and into the South before England, France, or Spain got themselves planted back into the continent?
Yeah, so there was that threat from other powers that land might be developed. You know, interestingly, just last night I was listening to a previous interview with the late historian Stephen Ambrose, and he was saying when Jefferson bought the Louisiana Purchase, and we got all that land, going basically from New Orleans up to the state of Washington and all, just that the Federalists were against that, thinking we already have all this land that is undeveloped. Why should we spend money on that? And what Ambrose said was the development of the steam engine for trains, and then also boats, that made that land much more valuable. And it's interesting as we talk about legislation that there are future developments that sometimes you can't see. I mean, as Jefferson bought that land just to secure it for the United States. But in the day when he bought that, everyone was just moving, maybe 10 miles a day on horse. And they're thinking, well, that'll be hundreds of years before we get out there. And of course, future developments came along. So it's fascinating that you have, even to this day, it's something when we cover legislation at the federal or state level, sometimes you have people who are looking at the conditions just of today, and others who are looking forward that the world is going to be changing. And sometimes when we're talking about just a landmass, you want to secure that so that as the country grew, we had space to go out there and to wrestle with all these issues. That it's interesting that these people, it was like a tug of war constantly between both the idea of slavery, but also of expanding the nation and securing those resources from the threat of other nations like perhaps Great Britain. What are we to make? Would you say? Let's bring it a little forward here, as we have these debates today, and it seems people get onto a theme, and one of the big themes of today is slavery and racism. Not so much slavery, but racism, and so we see racism. They used to say about the Republicans in the 1950s, they saw a communist under every bed. It's kind of like today that I think people see a racist too often because it suits their political agenda. But how is it a historian where you're not looking just at the present, you're looking at the context of time and how the political arguments of the nation developed? Literally, over 160 years or so. How do you view some of this? And as we now have, as we said earlier, Douglas having his statue removed from the Capitol grounds, his portrait in the House chamber of the state Capitol covered. Or what are you to make of this, or what do you make of this?
Yeah, I would say, Terry, that things don't change. It's interesting to me that even in Douglas's day, the same issues that we hear today were being discussed then, and even fought legislatively then, and in the courts then. In Douglas's day, the Irish, the Germans, the Catholics were anathema to a number of people, and in fact, Douglas represented, for the Democrats, of course, but represented what was called the alien vote. Whigs tried to stop, and these were Whigs like Dan Stone, who, with Abraham Lincoln, voted against abolitionist or stopping abolitionist society. That was in 1836 in the legislature. But Whigs were trying to stop Irish and Germans, particularly, from voting. And these were immigrants who had come in to build railroads, or immigrants who were escaping oppression from the Palatinates in what became Germany. But they were voting democratically. They saw the other side as protecting slavery, and they were trying to get away from these kinds of authoritarian um, um, slave owners. And so the result was Whigs tried to stop the vote, and won a case in the Illinois Supreme Court for citizens from Ireland and other countries to vote. And what he pointed out was simply the Constitution of Illinois said all you had to be was white, male, 21, and a resident of Illinois for at least 6 months, and you were a resident of Illinois who could vote. And his case predominated. Now, we see the same things happening today with the attempts to suppress the votes. And basically, they are the votes of people of color or Latino or that sort of thing. So we don't change. And the reason we're not changing, I think, is because we still act in a visceral or passionate way. You know, one of my favorite speeches was by Abraham Lincoln at the Lyceum in Springfield, in which he said, you know, we've gone beyond the age of passion, the Revolution, the War of 1812, and our great patriots are dying off. What we must do is adopt reason, cold, calculating reason. The unfortunate thing was that we really haven't adopted that. We're still acting from a visceral sense, and you know, in letting our passions control us rather than thinking about, is there really anything wrong in a democracy for allowing people to vote, for example? So what I would say is that we don't change emotionally. We have the great ability to change rationally, but we're still acting as we did in the mid 18th century by our passions ruling us too often.
Before we close out, let's talk about your current book is Stephen Douglas, The Early Years in Congress, 1844 to 1850. So presumably you're going to pick up the last 10 years of his life in volume 3 from 1860 or 1850 to 1861 when he passes away, just after Abraham Lincoln, his longtime political opponent, becomes president in March of 1861. So they were only about 2 years, or 2 months, I should say, or when Douglas was alive while Lincoln was president. What do you know what you're going to focus on in those years? Or are you still doing the research? And obviously during that time we had the famous Senate election of 1858 where Lincoln and Douglas debated each other around the state of Illinois.
Really, the focus is going to be toward the end of Douglas's life. I think the debates of 1858 are so well covered, and great historians have done great works on them. I've read each of the debates. I've studied them. I don't find too much more that can be discussed. Even Lincoln's famous Freeport question is really a moot question to me. It's answered by Douglas, as he said, hundreds of times before Lincoln continued to raise it during debates. But what I'm really focusing on is the last few years of Douglas's life, where I believe he became really a great American statesman. Because this pressure was building up within the country, Douglas tried to alleviate the pressure, particularly in the South. He was going to the South more often, and in the campaign of 1860, he actually spent as much time in the South as he did in the North campaigning for himself. When he went, he knew as early as 1858 that a Republican likely would win the 1860 presidential election. And I've read somewhere, unfortunately I'm unable to find it, but he believed that it very well could be the dark horse from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. But Douglas knew that a Republican would win. He believed that the only way he could win was to get the election thrown into the House of Representatives by winning enough electoral votes to keep anyone from getting a majority of electoral votes. Lincoln did get enough electoral votes, but only in the North. So the point was that Douglas, when he knew that he was not going to win the 1860 election, and that was determined by the statewide elections in 1860 in August, because Republicans were winning all the statewide offices. And so he knew Democrats were going to lose the federal election too. Instead of continuing his own campaign, he turned south. And instead of campaigning there for Stephen Douglas, he campaigned for union and preservation of the Union. He talked about what can the South possibly gain by leaving the Union. It loses economic opportunities because the federal institutions that the South was borrowing from were in the North, primarily in New York City, with the financial institutions. So I think his greatest statesmanship occurred in the last few years of his life, and particularly the last few months of his life, when, at the request of Abraham Lincoln, he asked Illinois to stay in the Union. John A. Logan in Southern Illinois was a great general and a congressman, and was going to pull the Southern Illinois out and head to the South. Southern Illinois is actually farther south than Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. So Douglas talked to Logan and kept him in the Union, and then later that day talked to the legislature, who was reluctant to fund the federal coffers to provide for the Civil War. And no one knew how long it was going to be at that time. But Douglas did get the legislature to pass the funds needed by the federal government to support the war.
It's interesting, a couple of things. One, that Lincoln and Douglas, both from Illinois, were both candidates for president in 1860. And interesting that Douglas, who was still a relatively young man when he died, what was he, like 58 or so?
48.
48,
yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Very young. I mean, what impact he might have had on the development of the Civil War had he been alive during Lincoln's presidency. And for those who don't know, I mean, the two not only ran against each other in 1858, but here in Springfield, the old Capitol is still there, and that's where Lincoln was a lawyer, and Judge Douglas was as you said earlier, a member of the Illinois Supreme Court, and they would, their careers were intersecting all along the course, that these two political giants of the United States in that critical period leading up to the Civil War, Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln, amazing how their lives paralleled during that time period, and the political influence that Illinois had on the nation during those critical years. I know it's impossible to know, but have you speculated in your own mind what influence Douglas would have had he lived during the presidency of Lincoln?
Yeah. No, I haven't. I figure... Yeah.
I know it's an unfair question because, but...
Well, I was trained as a journalist, Terry, and it's just impossible to speculate on what might have happened. We know what did happen, and Douglas achieved a great deal. Lincoln obviously achieved a great deal. And, in looking at history, I love symmetries and serendipities of history. And as you say, we had two Illinoisans really influencing greatly the path of this country. And it was Douglas who put the Union together through his organization. And it was Abraham Lincoln who was destined, another Illinoisan who was destined to save the Union that Douglas put together. So it's fascinating that wonderful symmetry occurred with those two, the long and the short of it, the 5'4" Douglas and the 6'4" Lincoln, who put the nation together and preserved it.
Do you know, as we have your volume 2 up, do you know what, do you have a title for volume 3, or do you have any idea when that will be available for purchase or published?
I have a working title called Stephen A. Douglas, Union Man, 1851 to 1861. And but I had a different title for my second book, and my publisher suggested the title we have. I wasn't fond of it to begin with, but it's doing okay from a retailing standpoint. So my publisher knows more about titles and what appeals than I do. So I listen to the experts.
And for those who want to buy a copy, I presume it's available in most places where books are sold, huh?
all the Barnes and Nobles and Books a Million and Amazon.com. And there's a website that my website's called StephenADouglas.com, no period after the A, but StephenADouglas.com. And you can buy it there, and I sell it at my cost on my website. So McFarland's actually an academic publisher. I love the publisher because they gave me the opportunity to publish my first book when I had no idea that I even had something that was interesting. It was interesting to me, but would it be interesting to other people? And they asked me for the second book, asked if I had a second book, because the first one sold pretty well. And, so I love this publisher because they had an interest in me, and I will never deviate from loyalty to McFarland Press.
Do you get letters from readers? Do you know, I mean, how's it being received by those who are buying the books, not the publisher, but the readers of the book? Do you get some kind of feedback maybe on your website or elsewhere?
I've gotten feedback. I've gotten emails. Of course, my email's on the website, but I've gotten feedback. This time, I sent my manuscript before the publication to three historians whose books I have loved: Douglas Edgerton, Brian Dirk, and Joseph Fornieri. They're all professors. They all have their doctorates in history, and I just asked them, would they mind reading the manuscript and then letting me know what they thought of it. Last time I just wrote it and put it on the shelf, and McFarland, after seeing it, published it. I was interested this time, you know, how good is the history I write? And I was very pleasantly surprised that I got good comments, very good comments from all three of those historians, particularly a guy named Douglas Edgerton, who's written like 10 or 12 historic wonderful books. I've not met him, but I love the guy because he said I was writing the definitive life of Douglas as he saw it. And that went well beyond what I ever thought about my own capacity to write history. To have a major historian say that was just terrifically nice.
It's something, I think, for history that so many of us just presumed the United States was going to develop the way it did, and as if it was ordained that no matter what happened, we would have ended up the way we are. And I think that it's interesting for people to learn, and that there were key moments in the development of the nation, and in those moments, certain people like Douglas, like Lincoln, came to the fore and led the nation when it needed the leadership so that we ended up where we are as the nation now. That it wasn't just preordained. This could have gone any number of other directions. And I think that's the real interesting part of this, that it reminds us not merely what happened back in the day, but that as we face our own political challenges in our time, you need political leadership to nudge the nation on one side of an issue or another, and that the development of not only the United States, but world power, I mean, where would we have been had we not stood up to Nazi Germany and the militarists in Japan in World War II? That, the Churchills, the Roosevelts, et cetera, of the world. That history is always an ongoing story, and we are wrong to presume that developments as they ended up would have happened without a hard struggle and without strong leadership of those who were on the world stage at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I often thought, Terry, about what would have happened if Douglas, when attacked as he was pretty vociferously, particularly by John C. Calhoun, Jefferson Davis, Henry Foote, and others, and even those who said we need to go no farther than the Rocky Mountains. Why try to cross the Rocky Mountains? What happens if Douglas would have thrown up his hands? What would the nation have looked like? I can't speculate on that. Would there have been another person? In reading for my second book, 2,000 pages of the Congressional Globe, the transcripts of the debates and the orations and the appendixes of the longer orations in the Congress, you just don't see, after Daniel Webster left and Calhoun left and Henry Clay left, it was left to Douglas and William Seward and Salmon Chase and people like that to carry on the great measures or the consideration of the great measures that brought us where we are. Um, Maybe someone else would have stepped in, or maybe someone would have said, it's okay for the South to have California and the southern part of the United States. It's okay for Britain to have Oregon. It was Douglas who foisted who caused the decision to be made on Oregon. We didn't even talk about that, but the point is, if Douglas hadn't been here, we certainly would have had a different country. And there's so many other complications, automation, as you say, steam, which brought us technology, the use of useful technology. Um, Politicians who lied then. There's an interesting, fascinating place in my book where Douglas, the old prosecutor, gets Seward to admit that the election in which Zachary Taylor was elected was fraudulent because of something Seward did, and you'll read that in my book. Another surprise that I ran across in reading the Congressional Globe that I never would have come across. I've never read it before, but he gets Seward to admit some fraud in that election, which won the election because had New York not gone for Taylor but went for Cass, it had enough electoral votes for Cass to have been elected. And that was what Douglas was trying to point out. And then as an afterthought, he said Seward himself was elected fraudulently. So anyway, those come through in the book because they are there for the reading in the Congressional Globe. And that's why I'm so fascinated by the Globe. We don't have to read somebody else's interpretation. We read the orations of the men themselves.
You're a wealth of information, and we'll certainly look forward to talking to you again about the third volume when that comes out. Do you have any inkling at this point when that might be out?
I'm hoping the last one took 5 years. I'm hoping this takes 3 or 4. I use the David McCulloch method. I'm learning as I go along. I mean, the things I mentioned to you today, I didn't know when I started my second book. I just knew I had enough to start a second book, and I followed where the path went, and the second book emerged, almost 400 pages of small type, and I'm sorry about that, but and the next one seems to be just as engrossing. I'm hoping there's not a fourth book. That's my goal at this point.
Well, again, I was just recently listening, and it's interesting, both to David McCullough and I'm dropping his name, the film Ken Burns, and they were just saying as they get into a project, they don't know all that they're going to uncover, and so that the story is somewhat developed as it goes along, and it's always a work in progress. And I imagine that sometimes the process is a little bit like running down the road and closing your eyes. You're not knowing necessarily what you're going to uncover as you go along, right?
Exactly. And I out of the second, I cut 60,000 words out of the second book because it was getting so long, and then I decided, there really is a third book, and that's when I opened up to the idea that there's a third book, and so. You don't know, and the nice thing is you have the serendipity I talked about. You learn things as you go along that you think, that's sort of meaningless until you see it's put with something else. Douglas was never around slaves, for example, but he rode a train to Washington with his wife and brand new baby boy, his second boy. They took with them a young lady named Mahala Martin, and it was the first time Douglas had literally lived with a black person. And it was interesting. That story is developing, and I'm talking to a person who knows that family in North Carolina now, and she's been exceedingly helpful. And I found out there's a brother of this young man who was sired by one of the Martin brothers, who's white, and Charlie becomes a great playmate of the boys. And so so I'm learning about the relationship of Douglas for the first time in his life, living with African Americans, and it's a fascinating story.
Are there any? I know there are no longer descendants of Lincoln around. Are there Douglas descendants still around?
Yes, yeah, they still live in North Carolina, which is where Martha Martin Douglas was raised. They are Catholic. Douglas's second wife, Adele Cutts, was Catholic. Douglas had no religion, much like Lincoln. Never adopted, never joined an organized church, went to church once in a while. But his wife, his second wife, Adele Cutts, talked him into having his two boys become Catholic. And so the family, the Douglases who live in North Carolina and some live out east, are still Catholic, which was started by Adele Cutts, who I was fascinated to learn is the grandniece of Dolly Madison, President Madison's wife. Another interesting tidbit.
Are you well? Have you heard from the Douglas family as far as your biography of their famous descendant or ancestor, I
Yeah,
should say?
I have. I got a nice note on the about the first book. I haven't heard anything on the second book. I sent a copy to Robert Dick Douglas, who, like his great 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 grandfather, is an attorney, but I haven't heard back from him what he thought about the book. Um, you have to like history to read history, I think, unless you just get interested by the stories. And I try to make an interesting story out of these things. My writing, I think, is a lot better than my ability to communicate orally or verbally, but I've gotten good responses, at least initially, on the first book from the Douglas family. And I have met them. I've met the Douglas family, and they gave me a story which will, I think, be a tremendous piece of new history. Uh, I have a story which will end the third book already, and it has to do with the Civil War and Douglas's an unbelievable impact Douglas had on the Civil War, and one of the last things he did in his life. And
Well,
that's secret until you read the book.
Reg Ankrom, we appreciate you joining us. We've kept you for a long time here, but a lot of
Thank you, Terry.
information. I'm sure more to come. We'll look forward to telling the story as you go further. And it's always good, and we appreciate you sharing with us that these are not just people who were dust-covered statues. They are real people who wrestled as we do with the stories and the issues of their time, and those were, you might say, the sculptors that helped make the nation that we live in today because of what they did back then. So great to hear
Yeah.
these stories.
You're gracious to have me, Terry. Thank you so much for the time you've given me.
Thank,
Appreciate it a lot.
all right. Thanks so much. Take care.
You too.